The rain came down in sheets that November afternoon, turning the streets of Portland into rivers of gray. I sat in the passenger seat of Kyle's truck, watching the wipers struggle against the downpour, my hands twisted together in my lap. The law office of Walsh and Associates occupied the 12th floor of a glass building downtown. And with every floor we climbed in that elevator, I felt my stomach drop further. My parents had been gone for 3 weeks. 3 weeks since the car accident on Highway 26, 3 weeks since I'd gotten that call that split my life into before and after. My brother Daniel had handled everything, the funeral arrangements, the service, the endless parade of relatives and business associates. He'd been efficient, composed, every inch the successful lawyer everyone expected him to be. I'd stood beside him at the memorial, numb and small, while people shook his hand and told him how strong he was, how much he looked like our father. Nobody seemed to notice I was there at all. That was nothing new. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The elevator doors opened, and Mr. Gregory Walsh's receptionist greeted us with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She led us down a hallway lined with dark wood paneling and diplomas, the kind of place that smelled like old books and expensive cologne. Daniel was already there, sitting in one of the leather chairs outside Walsh's office, checking his phone. He looked up when I approached, his expression neutral. "Emma, you made it." Not a greeting, just an observation. His wife Vanessa sat beside him, her designer handbag perched on her lap like a small dog. She gave me the kind of look you'd give someone who'd shown up to a wedding in jeans. I was still wearing my scrubs from the clinic. I hadn't had time to change. Mr. Walsh opened his door then, a tall man with silver hair and reading glasses perched on his nose. "Please come in. All of you." His office was exactly what you'd expect, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive desk, windows overlooking the city. Rain streaked down the glass, blurring the view. We sat, Daniel and Vanessa on one side, me on the other, like we were preparing for battle rather than hearing our parents' final wishes. Walsh settled behind his desk and opened a manila folder, the kind that holds your whole life in a few pieces of paper. "I'll get straight to it," he said, his voice measured and professional. "Robert and Linda Torres left very specific instructions regarding their estate." He pulled out the will, pages clipped together, official and final. My heart hammered in my chest. Daniel leaned forward slightly, the posture of someone expecting good news. The Torres & Sons hardware chain, including all 5 locations, associated real estate, inventory and business accounts, valued at approximately $6.2 million, has been left in its entirety to Daniel Robert Torres. The words hung in the air like smoke. I felt them settle over me, heavy and suffocating. Daniel nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd always known. Vanessa's hand found his, squeezing it with a smile that was equal parts sympathy and satisfaction. Walsh continued, his eyes moving to me for just a moment. "The family home in Laurelhurst, along with its contents and associated accounts, also passes to Daniel Torres." I couldn't breathe. The house where I'd grown up, where Mom had taught me to bake bread in the kitchen, where Dad had built that treehouse in the backyard that I'd spent countless summer afternoons in. Gone. Not mine. Never meant to be mine. "To Emma Catherine Torres," Walsh said, and I forced myself to focus. "Your parents have left their personal effects, photographs and family heirlooms not specifically designated to the estate." Personal effects. Photographs. I felt something crack inside my chest, a fissure that ran deep. Daniel shifted in his seat, and when I glanced at him, I saw something that might have been discomfort, or maybe it was just impatience. Vanessa whispered something to him, too quiet for me to hear. "Is that everything?" Daniel asked Walsh, his tone businesslike, already moving forward. Walsh hesitated, his fingers resting on the folder. "There is one additional property. A warehouse in Astoria, purchased 8 years ago. The deed is held in a separate trust." Daniel frowned. "A warehouse? What for?" "Your parents never disclosed their intentions for it," Walsh said carefully. "The trust stipulates that the property can only be transferred under specific conditions, which I'll need to review with you both in more detail. For now, it remains in trust, inaccessible to either of you." Daniel waved a hand dismissively. Fine. We can deal with that later. The main assets are clear. He stood. Vanessa rising with him, already pulling out her phone. I'll need to meet with the business managers this week, start the transition process. Walsh nodded, making notes. I stayed in my chair, frozen, staring at the rain beyond the windows. Daniel glanced down at me, and for a moment, something flickered across his face. Emma, I know this might seem unfair, but Dad always intended for me to run the business. You have your career. You're doing well at the clinic. His voice was gentle. The tone you'd use with a child who didn't understand why they couldn't have dessert before dinner. I found my voice, though it came out smaller than I wanted. And the house. He sighed, the sound of someone being patient with the inevitable. You can come by and get whatever you want. Photographs, Mom's jewelry, whatever. But Vanessa and I need the space. We're planning to start a family. Of course they were. The golden child, expanding his perfect life into the home that had been ours. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady. Right. Of course. Walsh cleared his throat. Miss Torres, if you'd like to stay, we can discuss the trust property in more detail. Daniel was already at the door. I have a meeting at 3. Emma, call me later if you need anything. He left, Vanessa trailing behind him, her heels clicking on the hardwood. The door closed, and the silence that followed felt like falling. I sank back into the chair, and Walsh studied me over his glasses. Your parents loved you very much, Emma. I want you to know that. The words should have been comforting. Instead, they felt like a knife twisting. Then why? My voice cracked. Why leave me nothing? Walsh set down his pen, leaning back in his chair. Sometimes people make decisions based on assumptions. Your father believed Daniel needed the business to prove himself. He believed you'd already found your path. I laughed, a bitter sound. My path. Right. There is the matter of the Astoria property, Walsh continued. Your parents were quite specific about it. The trust cannot be dissolved or transferred until certain conditions are met, and both you and Daniel must be involved. I looked up at him, something stirring beneath the numbness. What kind of conditions? He pulled out another document, this one thicker, filled with legal language that made my head spin. The property must be developed into a community project that meets city approval and adheres to your parents' outlined vision. Both you and Daniel must serve as co-executors. Equal authority. Equal decision-making power. The words started to sink in, slow and heavy. Daniel has to work with me? If he wants access to the property, yes. And there's more. Walsh flipped to another page. During the development period, which cannot exceed 9 months, there can be no legal disputes between you and your brother, no public conflicts, and neither of you can withdraw from the arrangement. If any of these conditions are violated, the trust dissolves. And then what happens? Walsh's expression shifted, something that might have been satisfaction. Half the value of the property and associated funds goes to the charities your parents designated. The other half, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Goes directly to you. I stared at him, my mind racing. How much is the property worth? The warehouse and land are valued at approximately $1.8 million. There's also a development fund your parents established, another $700,000, specifically for this project. $2.5 million. Contingent on my cooperation. On Daniel needing me. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh. Does Daniel know about this? He will, Walsh said. I'm meeting with him tomorrow to go over the details. I wanted to speak with you first. I sat there, rain drumming against the windows, trying to process everything. My parents had left me almost nothing in the will everyone would see. But they'd created something else, something hidden, something that required Daniel to treat me as an equal. Why would they do this? I asked, more to myself than to Walsh. He folded his hands on the desk. Your father told me once that he worried he'd failed you. That he'd been so focused on grooming Daniel for the business that he'd forgotten to show you that you mattered just as much. This was his way of trying to correct that. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not here. Not now. When do I find out more about this project? There's a key, Walsh said, sliding a small envelope across the desk. To the warehouse. Your parents left instructions for you to visit it first, before Daniel. They said you'd understand once you saw it. I took the envelope, feeling the weight of the key inside. Thank you, Mr. Walsh. He nodded. Your parents were good people, Emma. They made mistakes like we all do, but they tried to make it right in the end. I left the office in a daze, riding the elevator back down to the lobby where Kyle was waiting, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when I approached, his expression shifting to concern. How bad? Worse than I thought, I said, and then after a pause. And maybe not as bad as I thought. I don't know yet. We drove through the rain in silence for a while, Kyle knowing me well enough not to push. Finally he asked, where to? I pulled out the envelope, studying the address written in my father's handwriting. Astoria. There's something I need to see. Kyle glanced at me then nodded. All right. Road trip it is. We stopped at my apartment first, a tiny studio in Selwood that I'd been renting for the past 2 years. It was all I could afford on a veterinarian's salary in Portland, a far cry from the spacious home I'd grown up in. I changed out of my scrubs, threw some clothes in a bag, and grabbed my rain jacket. The drive to Astoria took about 2 hours, the highway cutting through dense forests and small towns, the Columbia River appearing and disappearing between the trees. Kyle filled the silence with easy conversation, talking about his latest contracting job, a house renovation in the Pearl District. I was grateful for it, for the normalcy of his voice, for not having to think about Daniel's face when Walsh had read the will. By the time we reached Astoria, the rain had softened to a drizzle. The town sat right on the river, old Victorian houses climbing the hills, fishing boats bobbing in the harbor. It had a weathered charm, the kind of place that had seen better days but refused to give up. The warehouse was on the industrial side of town, a large brick building with high windows, some of them broken, others covered with plywood. It looked abandoned, forgotten. I used the key Walsh had given me, the lock sticking before finally turning. The door creaked open, and stale air rushed out. Kyle found a light switch, and fluorescent bulbs flickered to life overhead, illuminating the space. It was massive, the ceiling stretching up at least 20 feet, support beams crisscrossing overhead. But it wasn't empty. The warehouse was filled with tools. Workbenches lined the walls, vintage hand tools hanging on pegboards, their handles worn smooth with use. Table saws, drill presses, lathes, all older models but meticulously maintained. In the center of the space sat a large table covered with blueprints, held down by a red toolbox I recognized instantly. It had been my grandfather's, passed down to my father. Kyle whistled low. What is all this? I moved toward the table, my footsteps echoing in the vast space. The blueprints showed plans for renovating the warehouse, transforming it into something else. A community tool library and makerspace. Detailed drawings of classrooms, workshop areas, storage for the tools, even a small cafe. Notes in my father's handwriting covered the margins, ideas and measurements and dreams. I opened the toolbox carefully, and inside, nestled among wrenches and screwdrivers, was a sealed envelope with my name on it. My hands shook as I opened it, unfolding the letter inside. The handwriting was my mother's, her looping script instantly recognizable. My dearest Emma, it began, and my eyes blurred immediately. If you're reading this, then your father and I are gone, and you've discovered this place. I'm sorry for how we failed you, sweetheart. Your father and I got so caught up in building the business, in making sure Daniel was ready to take it over, that we forgot to show you how much you mattered to us. We forgot to make you feel seen. I had to stop reading, pressing my hand to my mouth to keep from sobbing. Kyle moved closer, his presence steady and grounding. The inheritance isn't in what you own, the letter continued, but in what you build for others. Your father and I bought this warehouse because we wanted to create something that would help people, really help them. A place where someone who couldn't afford tools could learn a trade, where kids could discover they love building things, where the community could come together. We wanted you to be the one to make it real. Not because Daniel isn't capable, but because you have something he doesn't. You see people, Emma. You've always seen people. The veterinary work you do, the way you care for those animals and their owners, the way you've always put others first. That's the legacy we're most proud of. This warehouse, this project, it needs someone who builds with their heart, not just their hands. We've set up the trust so that Daniel has to work with you as equals. Not because we wanted to punish him, but because we wanted him to finally see you the way we should have helped him see you all along. As his equal. As someone whose vision and heart are just as valuable as his business sense. The letter went on, detailing their hopes for the project, their regret for not doing this sooner, their absolute faith that I could make it something beautiful. It ended with a line that broke me completely. You were never the spare child, Emma. You were always the one we knew would change lives. We're sorry it took us so long to tell you. All our love always. Mom and Dad. I folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into the toolbox, and let myself cry. Kyle didn't say anything, just stood beside me, a hand on my shoulder, letting me fall apart in that dusty warehouse filled with tools and forgotten dreams. When I finally pulled myself together, I walked around the space, really looking at it. Despite the abandonment, despite the broken windows and the dust, I could see what it could become. The bones were good. The tools were here. The plans were detailed and thoughtful. All it needed was someone to believe in it. This is incredible, Kyle said, studying the blueprints. Your parents really thought this through. They did. My voice was steadier now. And apparently, Daniel has to help me build it, or he loses everything. Kyle looked up sharply. What? I explained the trust, the conditions, the timeline. With each word, I watched understanding dawn on his face, followed by something that looked a lot like admiration. Your parents were brilliant. They were something, I agreed. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Daniel. Need to talk. Walsh told me about the Astoria property. Call me. I stared at the message, then slipped the phone back into my pocket. Let him wait. For once in my life, I held the cards. For once, my brother needed me more than I needed him. The rain had started again outside, drumming on the warehouse roof, but inside, standing in the middle of my parents' secret dream, I felt something I hadn't felt in 3 weeks. I felt hope. I didn't call Daniel back that night. Instead, Kyle and I found a small motel near the waterfront, the kind with thin walls and a neon sign that buzzed in the rain. I lay awake for hours, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, my mother's letter playing on repeat in my mind. You were never the spare child. The words should have brought comfort, but instead they stirred something bitter and complicated. If they'd believed that, truly believed it, why had it taken their deaths for me to hear it? Why had I spent 32 years feeling invisible in my own family? Morning came gray and cold, the kind of November day that made you want to stay in bed forever. But I got up, showered in the tiny bathroom with its flickering light, and met Kyle for coffee at a diner down the street. The coffee was terrible, but it was hot, and that was enough. My phone had been buzzing all morning. 3 more texts from Daniel, each one slightly more insistent than the last. 2 missed calls. A voicemail I hadn't listened to. You're going to have to talk to him eventually, Kyle said, dumping sugar into his coffee. I know. I wrapped my hands around my mug, feeling the warmth seep into my fingers. I just need to figure out what I'm going to say first. Kyle studied me across the table, his expression thoughtful. We'd known each other since middle school, had stayed friends through all the years when most childhood friendships faded away. He'd been there through my parents' criticism, through Daniel's casual dismissals, through every moment when I'd felt small and unnecessary. What do you want to say? He asked. I thought about it, really thought about it. What did I want to say to the brother who'd gotten everything, who'd been praised and polished and prepared while I'd been patted on the head and told I was good with animals? I want to tell him that I'm not going to make this easy, I said finally. That if he wants this property, if he wants to keep his inheritance intact, he's going to have to see me. Really see me. Not as his little sister who doesn't understand business, but as someone who has just as much right to be here as he does. Kyle smiled, the kind that reached his eyes. Then tell him that. I picked up my phone. Daniel's number already pulled up, my thumb hovering over the call button. Then I put it down again. Not yet. First, I need to go back to Portland. I need to talk to Walsh, understand exactly what leverage I have. Then I'll talk to Daniel on my terms, not his. We drove back to Portland that afternoon, the rain finally breaking into patches of weak sunlight. The city looked different somehow, or maybe I was different. I'd left yesterday feeling crushed, flattened by the weight of my parents' will. I was coming back with something else, something that felt dangerously close to anger. And underneath that, determination. Walsh agreed to meet me that evening, after his regular office hours. When I arrived, the building was mostly empty, the lobby echoing with my footsteps. His receptionist had gone home, and Walsh answered the door himself, still in his suit but with his tie loosened, looking more human than he had the day before. "Emma," he said, gesturing me inside. "I'm glad you came. I assume you visited the warehouse." I did. I sat in the same leather chair, but this time I didn't feel small. And I read my mother's letter. Walsh nodded slowly. "Your parents agonized over this decision for months. They knew how it would look, leaving the business to Daniel. But they also knew that forcing him to work with you on this project was the only way to make him understand what he'd been taking for granted all these years." I leaned forward, my elbows on my knees. "Walk me through the trust again. All of it. I need to understand exactly what power I have here." Walsh pulled out the file, thicker than I remembered, and began to explain. The trust was ironclad, written by the best estate attorneys in the state. Daniel couldn't touch the Astoria property without my cooperation, couldn't sell it, couldn't develop it, couldn't even step foot on it legally without my permission. The 9-month timeline started the moment both of us signed the co-executor agreement. During those 9 months, we had to work together to complete the community project according to our parents' specifications. The plans had to be approved by the city. The project had to be functional and operational. And through it all, we couldn't fight publicly, couldn't sue each other, couldn't withdraw from the arrangement. What constitutes a public fight? I asked. Walsh adjusted his glasses. Anything that could be documented or witnessed by third parties. Private disagreements are expected and allowed. But the moment either of you takes the conflict outside your working relationship, lawsuits, public accusations, anything that could damage the project or your parents' legacy, the trust dissolves. And if we complete the project successfully, then the property transfers to both of you as joint owners. You'd have to come to an agreement about what to do with it long term, but you'd each have equal say. I sat back, processing. And if we fail? If Daniel refuses to participate, or if we can't complete it in 9 months, then the trust dissolves, and the assets are distributed according to the contingency plan. Half to charity, half to you. Walsh paused, watching me carefully. Your brother stands to lose a significant asset if this fails, Emma. That gives you considerable leverage. Considerable leverage. The words tasted strange in my mouth, unfamiliar. I'd never had leverage over Daniel in my entire life. He's going to fight this, I said. He's going to try to find a way around it. He already has, Walsh said, and I looked up sharply. He came to see me this morning with his own attorney. They spent 2 hours going through the trust, looking for loopholes. My stomach tightened. And there are none. Your parents made sure of that. Daniel left angry, but he left knowing he has no choice. He needs you, Emma. For the first time in his life, he needs you, and he can't buy his way out of it or argue his way around it. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt exhausted. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Parents weren't supposed to die and leave behind elaborate schemes to force their children to see each other as equals. Siblings weren't supposed to need legal documents to treat each other with respect. But this was the hand I'd been dealt, and I was going to play it. I want to set terms, I told Walsh. Before I agree to anything, before I sign any co-executor agreement, I want Daniel to agree to specific conditions. Walsh pulled out a legal pad, pen poised. I'm listening. I thought about the warehouse, about my mother's letter, about all the years of feeling invisible. First, I want a formal written apology from Daniel acknowledging how he and our parents treated me growing up. It doesn't have to be public, but it has to be real. Specific. Not just I'm sorry, but an actual acknowledgement of what happened. Walsh nodded, making notes. Second, I want him to cover my living expenses for the duration of the project. Rent, utilities, food, everything. If I'm going to dedicate 9 months to this, I can't also be worrying about paying my bills on a veterinarian's salary. Reasonable, Walsh said. What else? Third, I want access to the family home to retrieve my mother's things. Her jewelry, her books, the photo albums, anything that was hers. I want them now, before this project starts, because I don't trust that Vanessa won't throw them away or claim them for herself. Walsh's pen moved quickly across the page. I can arrange that. Anything else? I hesitated, then pushed forward. I want one of the hardware stores. Walsh's pen stopped. He looked up at me, eyebrows raised. Emma, that's not part of the trust. The stores belong to Daniel outright. I know. But if he wants my cooperation, if he wants this project to succeed so he can keep the Astoria property, then he's going to give me one store. Not as a gift, as a transfer of ownership. Legal and binding. Considerate payment for my time and expertise. He'll never agree to that, Walsh said, but there was something in his voice, a hint of approval. Then he can watch the trust dissolve and lose $2.5 million, I said. His choice. Walsh leaned back in his chair, studying me with open curiosity. You've changed since yesterday. Yesterday I was grieving, I said. Today I'm angry. There's a difference. He smiled just a little. I'll draft the terms and send them to Daniel's attorney. But Emma, you should know, pushing him this hard, there's a risk he'll walk away entirely, let the trust dissolve out of spite. Then he's stupider than I thought, I said. He's losing money he doesn't have yet. I'm losing nothing I didn't already lose yesterday. Walsh nodded slowly. Fair point. I'll have the documents ready by tomorrow afternoon. In the meantime, you should prepare yourself. When Daniel sees these terms, he's not going to be happy. Good, I said and meant it. I left Walsh's office feeling something electric running through my veins. For 32 years I'd been the good daughter, the accommodating sister, the one who accepted whatever scraps were thrown her way with gratitude. Not anymore. Not ever again. Kyle was waiting in his truck outside, engine running, heat blasting. I climbed in, and he took one look at my face and grinned. You did something. I set terms, I said, buckling my seatbelt. Aggressive terms. Tell me everything. I did, laying out each condition as Kyle drove through the darkening streets of Portland. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. A whole hardware store. Emma, that's brilliant. Even if he says no to everything else, that's your real negotiating chip. I know, I said. Walsh thinks he'll refuse. Walsh doesn't know Daniel like you do, Kyle said. Daniel's not going to let $2.5 million slip away, especially not when his wife finds out. Vanessa will push him to agree, guarantee it. He was right, I realized. Vanessa, who'd married Daniel for his prospects and his family name, who'd been planning their life in that Laurelhurst house with the kind of certainty that came from always getting what she wanted. She wouldn't let Daniel's pride cost them that much money. My apartment felt smaller than ever when I got back, the walls closing in. I made tea I didn't drink, tried to watch television I didn't see, finally gave up and pulled out my laptop. If Daniel was going to fight me on this, I needed to be prepared. I needed to understand not just the trust, but the business, the properties, all of it. I spent the next 3 hours digging through public records, business filings, property assessments. Torres & Sons Hardware had 5 locations as I'd known, but what I hadn't known was that 2 of them were struggling. The Beaverton location had been operating at a loss for the past year. The Gresham store wasn't much better. But the original location, the one in southeast Portland where my grandfather had started the business 50 years ago, that one was thriving. High foot traffic, loyal customer base, prime real estate. That was the one I wanted. Not the struggling stores Daniel would try to foist on me, but the crown jewel, the one with history and profit and potential. I drafted an email to Walsh specifying which store I wanted and why, backing it up with the financial data I'd found. If Daniel was going to negotiate, I wanted Walsh armed with facts, not just demands. My phone rang at 10:30, just as I was getting ready for bed. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. I let it ring twice more before answering. Hello, Daniel. What the hell are you doing? His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the anger underneath. Walsh sent over your terms. This is insane, Emma. You can't actually expect me to agree to this. Why not? I kept my voice calm, almost pleasant. You got 6.2 million and a house. I'm asking for an apology, some temporary financial support, mom's belongings, and one store out of 5. Seems fair to me. Fair. He laughed, sharp and bitter. You want me to hand over a store worth over $1 million because you're upset about the will. I want you to acknowledge that Mom and Dad made a mistake, I said. That they shortchanged me my entire life, and that you benefited from that. And yes, I want compensation for the 9 months of my life I'm about to spend fixing their mistake. Silence on the other end, heavy and tense. I waited, listening to him breathe. The Gresham store, he said finally. I'll transfer the Gresham location. That's my offer. No. Emma, be reasonable. The Southeast location, I said. The original store. That's the one I want, and that's the one you're going to give me. Or I walk away and you lose Astoria. More silence, longer this time. I imagined him in his expensive condo, probably in his home office with its view of the Willamette River, his jaw clenched the way it got when things didn't go his way. Let me think about it, he said finally. You have until tomorrow at 5, I told him. After that, the offer expires and my terms get steeper. This isn't a negotiation, Emma. This is extortion. No, I said. This is me finally understanding my worth. Something you and Dad never bothered to teach me. Good night, Daniel. I hung up before he could respond, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. My hands were shaking. I'd never spoken to my brother like that, never stood up to him with that kind of certainty. It felt terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay in the dark, replaying the conversation, second-guessing everything. What if I'd pushed too hard? What if he called my bluff and I ended up with nothing but my parents' photo albums and the bitter satisfaction of having stood my ground? But then I thought about my mother's letter, about her regret, about the warehouse full of tools and dreams. I thought about 32 years of being overlooked, dismissed, treated like an afterthought in my own family. No, I hadn't pushed too hard. If anything, I hadn't pushed hard enough. The next morning crawled by. I went to the clinic, went through the motions of examining pets and talking to their worried owners, but my mind was elsewhere. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach jumped. But it was never Daniel, just appointment reminders and a text from Kyle asking if I'd heard anything. By 3 in the afternoon, I was a wreck. By 4, I was convinced Daniel was going to let the deadline pass out of spite. At 4:45, Walsh called. He agreed. Walsh said, and I could hear the surprise in his voice. To everything? Everything. The apology, the living expenses, access to your mother's belongings, and the Southeast Portland location. His attorney is drafting the paperwork now. I sat down hard on the bench outside the clinic, my legs suddenly unreliable. He agreed to the Southeast store. He did. Apparently his wife convinced him. I got a call from her attorney about an hour ago, making it very clear that refusing your terms wasn't an option. Kyle had been right. Vanessa wasn't about to let her lifestyle slip away, because of Daniel's pride. When do we sign? I asked. I'll have everything ready by Monday. Can you come to the office at 10? I'll be there. I hung up and just sat there for a moment, watching traffic move past on the street, feeling the November cold seep through my jacket. I'd won. I'd actually won. My phone buzzed again, and this time it was Daniel. Not a call, just a text. You've made your point. See you Monday. No apology, no acknowledgement, just terse acceptance. That was fine. The real apology would come in writing, legally binding. Something I could keep forever as proof that this had happened. That I hadn't imagined 32 years of being invisible. I called Kyle, and he answered on the first ring. Tell me. He agreed to everything, including the Southeast store. Kyle whooped so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. Emma Torres, you brilliant, ballsy woman. We're celebrating. Tonight. I'm taking you to that Italian place you love. The one you never let me take you to because it's too expensive. Kyle, you don't have to do that. I absolutely do. You just won $1 million store through sheer force of will. We're celebrating. I laughed, really laughed, for the first time since the accident. Okay. Oh yes. Let's celebrate. That night, over pasta and red wine I actually let myself enjoy. Kyle raised his glass. To Emma Torres, who finally learned to fight back. I clinked my glass against his. To fighting back, I echoed. But even as I said it, even as I felt the warm glow of victory, I knew this was just the beginning. I'd gotten Daniel to agree to my terms, but the real battle was still ahead. 9 months of working together, of trying to build something meaningful while navigating years of resentment and hurt. 9 months of proving I was more than the little sister he'd dismissed, that I deserved the space I was claiming. The warehouse in Astoria waited, full of tools and potential. The community project waited, sketched out in my father's handwriting. And somewhere in all of it, maybe there was a chance at something resembling reconciliation, or at least understanding. But first I had to get through Monday. First, I had to sit across from my brother and watch him sign papers that admitted, finally, that he'd been wrong about me. That was going to be its own kind of victory. The weekend passed in a blur of preparation. I went through the house, the one I'd grown up in, the one that would soon belong to Daniel and Vanessa completely. Margaret, the housekeeper who'd worked for my parents for 20 years, let me in with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Emma," she whispered as she unlocked the door. "Your mother would be heartbroken if she knew." I squeezed her hand, not trusting myself to speak. The house felt like a museum, everything exactly where my parents had left it, but emptied of the life that had filled it. I moved through the rooms methodically, taking my mother's jewelry box from her dresser, her favorite books from the study, the photo albums from the hallway closet. Each item felt weighted with memory, with the life I was leaving behind. In my old bedroom, I found things I'd forgotten about. The science fair trophy from 8th grade, tucked in the back of a closet. The acceptance letter to veterinary school, still in its frame on the wall where my mother had insisted on putting it. A shoebox full of birthday cards, most of them from Arthur and Patty, my father's parents and sister. The ones who'd always remembered me even when my own parents seemed too busy. I packed it all carefully into boxes Kyle had brought over, his truck parked in the driveway like a getaway car. We worked in silence mostly, the weight of what was happening too heavy for casual conversation. When Vanessa showed up unexpectedly, walking in like she already owned the place, I was in the kitchen, packing my mother's recipe box. "Emma," she said, her voice carrying that false brightness she used when she wanted something. "I didn't know you were here." "Walsh arranged it," I said, not looking up from the recipes. "I'm taking Mom's things." Of course. Vanessa moved around the kitchen, running her fingers over the granite countertops, already measuring for changes. "I wanted to talk to you actually, about this whole Astoria situation." I straightened, turning to face her. She was dressed impeccably as always, designer jeans and a cashmere sweater, her blonde hair perfectly styled. Everything about her screamed expensive and curated. "What about it?" "Daniel told me about your terms," she said, and I saw the calculation in her eyes. The store, the apology, all of it. "I just want you to know, I'm the one who convinced him to agree." "I know," I said. "Walsh told me." She looked surprised, then recovered quickly. "Right. Well, I think you should also know that I think you're being smart. Daniel and your father, they never appreciated you the way they should have. This project, it's a good opportunity for you to prove yourself." The condescension dripped from every word, and I felt my jaw tighten. "I don't need to prove myself to anyone, Vanessa. Least of all to you or Daniel." Her smile froze. "I'm just trying to be supportive." "No, you're trying to make sure Daniel doesn't blow $2.5 million because his ego can't handle working with his little sister. Let's not pretend this is about anything else." Color rose in her cheeks, but she kept her composure. "You've changed, Emma. You used to be so sweet." "I used to be a doormat," I corrected. "There's a difference." I turned back to the recipe box, effectively dismissing her. After a moment, I heard her heels clicking out of the kitchen, retreating to whatever other room she was planning to redecorate. Kyle appeared in the doorway, eyebrows raised. "That was ice cold. I'm impressed." "I'm tired of playing nice," I said, closing the recipe box carefully. "She married my brother for his money and his prospects. The least she can do is be honest about it." We finished packing by early afternoon, Kyle's truck loaded with boxes of my childhood, my mother's life, the pieces of the family I wanted to keep. As I took one last walk through the house, I felt strange. Not sad exactly, but hollow. This place had never really felt like home. Not the way other people described home. It had always been more like a stage where I played the role of daughter and sister, never quite getting the lines right. Maybe that was why leaving felt less like loss and more like liberation. Monday morning arrived cold and bright, the kind of November day where the sun made everything look sharp and clear. I dressed carefully, professional but not trying too hard. A simple black dress, my mother's pearl earrings, low heels. I wanted to look like someone who belonged in a lawyer's office negotiating million-dollar deals, because that's exactly what I was. Walsh's office felt different this time. I wasn't the grieving daughter being told she'd inherited nothing. I was a co-executor about to claim what I'd earned. Daniel was already there when I arrived, sitting in the conference room with his attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Levine, who looked like she ate weaker lawyers for breakfast. He stood when I entered, and for a moment we just looked at each other. He looked tired, I realized. The put-together veneer he always maintained had cracks in it, shadows under his eyes, a tightness around his mouth. "Emma," he said, and it wasn't warm, but it wasn't hostile either. Just acknowledgement. "Daniel." I sat across from him, Walsh taking the seat at the head of the table. Patricia Levine laid out the documents, multiple copies of everything, each page flagged with little colored tabs showing where signatures were needed. "Let's start with the apology," Walsh said, sliding a single page toward Daniel. As agreed, this will be read aloud and signed before we proceed with the other documents. Daniel's jaw worked, and I saw his attorney lean over, whispering something to him. He nodded stiffly, then picked up the paper. His hands, I noticed, weren't quite steady. "Emma," he began, his voice formal, rehearsed. "I want to apologize for the way you've been treated throughout your life by our family, and specifically by me. I acknowledge that our parents showed favoritism toward me in ways that were hurtful and unfair to you. They invested in my education, my career, and my future in ways they did not invest in yours. They included me in business decisions and family planning while excluding you, sending the message that your opinions and presence didn't matter." He paused, and I saw him swallow hard before continuing. "I benefited from this favoritism without questioning it or standing up for you. I dismissed your accomplishments and your capabilities because it was easier than challenging the family dynamic. I treated you as less than equal, less than worthy of respect, and I was wrong." The words hung in the air between us, formal and stilted, but they're nonetheless. "I recognize now that you are just as intelligent, just as capable, and just as deserving of our parents' love and support as I was. I'm sorry for my part in making you feel invisible in your own family. I'm sorry for not seeing you." His voice cracked slightly on that last part, and I saw something in his eyes that might have been genuine regret. Daniel set the paper down and signed it with quick, precise strokes. Walsh notarized it immediately, then slid a copy across to me. I folded it carefully and tucked it into my bag, not trusting myself to speak yet. The apology hadn't erased 32 years of hurt, but it was something. It was acknowledgement, written and witnessed, that what had happened to me was real and wrong. "Now the co-executor agreement," Walsh continued, pulling forward a thicker stack of papers. "This establishes Emma Torres and Daniel Torres as equal co-executors of the Astoria Property Trust. Both parties have equal authority over all decisions related to the development project. Both signatures are required for any expenditures over $5,000, any contracts with vendors or contractors, and any modifications to the original plans submitted by Robert and Linda Torres." Patricia Levine leaned forward, her pen tapping against her legal pad. "My client wants it clearly stated that equal authority means equal responsibility. If this project fails, both parties share the consequences equally." "Agreed," Walsh said. "The trust language already specifies that. Any failure to complete the project within the 9-month timeline results in dissolution of the trust, with assets distributed as outlined. Both parties lose." Daniel shifted in his seat. "And what constitutes failure? We need specifics. What if we complete the project but the city doesn't approve it? What if there are delays beyond our control? The trust allows for reasonable delays due to circumstances beyond your control, Walsh explained. Weather delays, permit processing times, those are factored in. But deliberate stalling, refusal to cooperate, or failure to make good faith efforts to complete the project, those void the agreement. How is good faith effort measured? Patricia asked. By documented progress, Walsh said. Weekly reports submitted to my office detailing work completed, decisions made, and any obstacles encountered. If either party stops participating or actively sabotages the project, that's grounds for dissolution. I spoke up for the first time. I want it added that all decisions must be made jointly. Daniel doesn't get to make choices, and then inform me after the fact. We discuss, we agree, we move forward together, or we don't move forward at all. Daniel's eyes met mine across the table. That's going to slow everything down. Then we'll work efficiently, I said. But I'm not going to be a rubber stamp for your decisions. That's the whole point of this, isn't it? Mom and Dad wanted us to work together as equals. That means my voice matters just as much as yours. He looked like he wanted to argue, but Patricia put a hand on his arm. It's fair, Daniel. It protects you too. She can't make unilateral decisions either. He nodded slowly, reluctantly. Fine. Joint decisions on everything. Walsh made a note on the document, and we moved forward. The financial arrangements were next. Daniel would transfer $4,500 monthly into an account for my living expenses, effective immediately and continuing through the 9-month project timeline. It wasn't extravagant, but it was enough to cover my rent, utilities, food, and transportation without having to worry about stretching my clinic's salary. This arrangement terminates upon completion of the project or dissolution of the trust, whichever comes first, Patricia noted. After that, you're on your own again. Understood, I said. The message was clear. This wasn't permanent support, just temporary accommodation while I worked on something that benefited Daniel just as much as it benefited me. Then came the part I'd been waiting for. The transfer of the Southeast Portland hardware store. Walsh slid the deed transfer documents across the table, and I felt my heart rate pick up. This was real. This was happening. The property located at 4725 Southeast Hawthorne Boulevard, including the building, land, inventory, and all associated assets, will transfer from Daniel Robert Torres to Emma Catherine Torres. Effective upon signing of these documents, Walsh read aloud. The transfer is complete and irrevocable. Emma Torres assumes all rights, responsibilities, and liabilities associated with the property from this date forward. Daniel stared at the papers like they were a death sentence. His hand hovered over them. Pen gripped tight enough that his knuckles had gone white. This is the most profitable location, he said, not looking at me. I know, I replied. Then you know what you're taking from me. I know what I'm taking back, I corrected. This store was built by Grandpa Torres. It's been in the family for 50 years. It should have been part of my inheritance too, but it wasn't. So yes, I'm taking it, and I'm not going to feel guilty about it. Vanessa had apparently coached him well, because he didn't argue further. He just signed, each stroke of the pen looking like it physically pained him. When it was done, Walsh notarized the documents and handed me my copies. I was now the sole owner of $1 million hardware store. The weight of it hadn't quite hit me yet. There's one more item, Walsh said, pulling out a final document. The access agreement for your mother's belongings. Daniel agrees to provide Emma unrestricted access to the family home for the purpose of retrieving Linda Torres's personal effects, including but not limited to jewelry, books, photographs, and any items of sentimental value. This access has already been provided, but we're documenting it here for the record. Daniel signed that one without hesitation. Maybe because it was already done, or maybe because giving up dead woman's jewelry was easier than giving up profit margins. When all the papers were signed, notarized, and copied, Walsh stacked them neatly and placed them in separate folders for each of us. The meeting had taken less than an hour, but it felt like I'd lived through several lifetimes. You'll both receive detailed packets about the Astoria project by the end of the week, Walsh said, including the full scope of your parents' plans, the development budget, and the timeline. I recommend you visit the property together soon to begin planning your approach. Daniel and I stood at the same time. And there was an awkward moment where neither of us knew quite what to do. Shake hands? Hug. Pretend this was all normal and professional? I'll call you this week, Daniel said finally. We should meet at the warehouse, go through the plans together. All right, I agreed. He left with Patricia, and I heard them talking in low, urgent tones as they walked down the hallway. Walsh waited until they were gone, then turned to me with something that might have been pride in his expression. You held your ground. Your mother would be proud. My mother should have held her ground while she was alive, I said, and the bitterness surprised even me. Then I wouldn't have needed to fight for scraps of my own inheritance. Walsh didn't argue with that. He just handed me my folder of documents and walked me to the door. The next 9 months won't be easy, Emma. Working with Daniel, building this project, there will be moments when you want to walk away. I won't walk away, I said. My parents wanted this built. They wanted it enough to stake their entire legacy on it. I'm going to see it through. For them. Walsh asked. For me. I corrected. They just gave me the excuse to finally do something that matters. The hardware store became real to me 3 days later when I walked through its doors for the first time as the owner. It was a Wednesday morning, early enough that the parking lot was mostly empty. The building was solid brick, weathered but well maintained, with large windows displaying tool arrangements and seasonal promotions. A hand-painted sign above the door read Torres & Sons Hardware Estate 1975. My grandfather's pride rendered in fading paint. Inside, the smell hit me first. Sawdust and motor oil, metal and possibility. The aisles stretched back into comfortable gloom. Industrial shelving stacked with everything from screws to circular saws. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and somewhere in the back I could hear the beep of a forklift. The store manager, a weathered man in his 60s named Frank Delgado, met me at the front counter. He'd been with the store for 30 years, had known my grandfather, had watched the business grow and change. When Daniel had called to tell him about the ownership transfer, Frank had apparently laughed for a solid minute before asking if this was some kind of joke. Miss Torres, he said now, extending a calloused hand. Or should I say boss? Emma's fine, I said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, testing. I know this is unexpected. Unexpected is one word for it, Frank agreed. Your brother called it highway robbery, but I told him if you robbed him of anything, it was something he took for granted in the first place. I liked Frank immediately. He gave me the full tour, walking me through every department, introducing me to the staff of 12 who ran the place. Most of them were lifers, people who'd been there for decades, who knew the inventory like they knew their own homes. They watched me with cautious curiosity, probably wondering if I was going to come in and change everything, if I had any idea what I was doing. I didn't blame them for the suspicion. Your grandfather built this place on 3 principles, Frank told me as we stood in the tools section, surrounded by hammers and levels. Quality products, fair prices, and treating customers like neighbors instead of transactions. Your father kept those principles mostly. Your brother wanted to modernize, increase margins, cut back on the personal service stuff. And what do you think should happen? I asked. Frank studied me for a long moment. I think a hardware store works best when the people running it actually care about the community it serves. When they know their customers by name and remember that Mrs. Chun needs the lightweight hammer because of her arthritis, and that the Johnsons are working on their deck and might need advice on wood treatment. Your brother saw numbers. Your grandfather saw people. I see people, I said quietly. That's what I'm counting on, Frank replied. We spent the rest of the morning going over the books, the profit and loss statements, the inventory systems. The store was profitable, solidly so, but there was room for improvement. The online presence was minimal, just a basic website that hadn't been updated in 3 years. The social media accounts were ghost towns. And the community outreach programs my grandfather had started, the workshops on basic home repair and the tool lending library for low-income families, those had been quietly discontinued 2 years ago when Daniel took over management. Why were the community programs cut? I asked Frank as we sat in the cramped office that was now mine, surrounded by filing cabinets and dusty motivational posters. Daniel said they weren't cost-effective, Frank explained. Too much time and resources for not enough return on investment. I argued with him about it, told him those programs brought in loyal customers, built goodwill. He said goodwill doesn't pay the bills. I thought about the warehouse in Astoria, about my parents' dream of a community tool library and makerspace. It seemed they'd watched Daniel get the very thing they valued most from the family business, and decided to create something he couldn't touch, something that would force him to remember what mattered. We're bringing them back, I decided. All of them. The workshops, the tool lending library, everything Grandpa started. Frank's weathered face split into a genuine smile. That's going to eat into profits. Only short term, I said. Long term, it builds loyalty, brings in new customers, especially younger ones who are just learning to fix things themselves. And it's the right thing to do. Your grandfather would have liked you running this place, Frank said. He always said you had his heart for people. The comment caught me off guard, made my throat tight. He said that all the time. He used to tell me Emma's got the soul of this business even if nobody sees it yet. Guess he was right. I had to look away, blinking back sudden tears. My grandfather had died when I was 19, long before any of this inheritance drama, before I'd even finished college. But he'd seen something in me that my own parents had missed, or at least had forgotten to nurture. The rest of that week passed in a blur of learning curves and late nights. I worked at the clinic during the day, then spent evenings at the store, going over systems with Frank, meeting with vendors, planning the revival of the community programs. Kyle helped when he could, giving me advice on the construction and repair side of things, connecting me with contractors who might want to teach workshops. It was exhausting and exhilarating and terrifying all at once. And through it all, Daniel's promised phone call never came. By Friday, I was frustrated enough to call him myself. He answered on the fourth ring, sounding distracted. Emma, I was going to call you. When? It's been almost a week since we signed the agreements. We need to start planning the Astoria project. I know. Things have been busy at work. Big case just landed on my desk. Daniel, we have a 9-month timeline that started the moment we signed those papers. We can't afford to waste time because your law practice is busy. Silence on the other end, then a sigh. You're right. Okay, how about next Saturday? We'll drive up to Astoria together, spend the day going through the warehouse and the plans. Together. The word felt strange, weighted with years of separation despite growing up in the same house. All right. I'll meet you there at 9 in the morning. I'll pick you up, Daniel said. No point taking 2 cars. The offer surprised me, but I accepted it. Maybe this was his version of extending an olive branch. Or maybe he just wanted to control the logistics. Either way, it was a start. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment with the folder Walsh had given me, the one containing all the documentation about the Astoria property. My parents' plans were meticulous, detailed drawings and specifications, budget breakdowns, timelines for each phase of construction. They'd envisioned the warehouse as a 3-part space. The main floor would house the community tool library, with organized storage for everything from basic hand tools to more specialized equipment. Members could check out tools for free with a library card system, removing the barrier of cost for people who needed to fix something, but couldn't afford to buy tools they'd only use once. The second section would be dedicated to workshop and classroom space, with areas for teaching everything from basic carpentry to small engine repair, welding to furniture building. My father had made notes in the margins about partnering with local trade schools, about creating pathways for people to learn skills that could turn into careers. The third section, smaller but no less important, would be a gathering space. A cafe-style area with tables and chairs, a small kitchen, a place where people could come together, share knowledge, build community around the act of making and fixing things. It was beautiful. It was ambitious. And it was going to be incredibly difficult to pull off in 9 months. But as I studied the plans, running my fingers over my father's handwriting, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about claiming my inheritance anymore, or proving myself to Daniel, or even honoring my parents' memory. This was about building something that would outlast all of us. Something that would help people long after the family drama was forgotten. Kyle came by late that evening with Thai food, and found me surrounded by papers, My laptop opened to contractor websites. A legal pad covered in notes and calculations. "You're in deep," he observed, setting the food down on my tiny kitchen table. "I'm trying to figure out if this is even possible," I admitted. "The timeline is so tight, and the budget, Kyle, it's generous but it's not unlimited. If we go over, if we hit unexpected problems, we could run out of money before we're finished." "So we don't hit unexpected problems," Kyle said, opening containers of pad thai and green curry. "We plan for every contingency, we build in buffers, and we work with people we trust." "You say we like you're going to be part of this." He looked at me over his container of noodles. "Emma, I'm a general contractor. This is literally what I do. You think I'm going to let you tackle a $2.5 million renovation project without my help?" "I can't afford to pay you what you're worth," I said. "The budget is allocated for specific contractors and laborers." "Then I'll volunteer my project management services," Kyle said. "Consider it my contribution to the community. Plus, someone needs to keep you and Daniel from killing each other." I laughed despite myself. That's a full-time job right there. We ate in comfortable silence for a while, and then Kyle asked the question I'd been avoiding. "How are you really doing with all this? Not the business stuff, not the project. How are you doing?" I set down my fork, considering. How was I doing? My parents were dead. My brother had gotten almost everything. I'd had to fight for scraps of recognition and compensation. I was juggling a full-time job at the clinic with learning to run a hardware store while preparing to manage a massive construction project. And somehow, despite all of it, I felt more alive than I had in years. "I'm angry," I said finally. At my parents for waiting until they were gone to finally see me. At Daniel for being so comfortable with the inequality that he never questioned it. At myself for accepting it for so long. "That's fair," Kyle said. But I'm also grateful, in a weird way. If they hadn't died, if they hadn't set up this elaborate trust, I might have spent the rest of my life being invisible. Now I'm not invisible anymore. Now I own a business and I'm about to build something that matters. It took tragedy to get here, but I'm here. Kyle reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Your parents made mistakes, but they did love you. I really believe that. They just didn't know how to show it in a way you could feel." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe they loved the idea of me but not the reality. Maybe I was too different from what they expected, and they didn't know what to do with that." "Then they were fools," Kyle said simply. "Because the reality of you is pretty damn remarkable." I smiled at that, grateful for him in ways I couldn't articulate. He'd been there through everything, never judging, always supporting, asking nothing in return but my friendship. "Thank you," I said. "For all of this. For being here." "Where else would I be?" he replied, and it was that simple for him. That uncomplicated. Saturday arrived gray and drizzly, typical Pacific Northwest November weather. Daniel pulled up to my apartment at exactly 9 in the morning, driving the same luxury sedan our father had favored, black and pristine and expensive. I climbed into the passenger seat, my backpack full of notebooks and the plans Walsh had given me. "Morning," Daniel said, pulling back into traffic. "Morning." The drive to Astoria was long and awkward. Daniel tried to make small talk at first, asking about the clinic, about how I was settling into running the hardware store. I answered in brief sentences, not quite willing to be comfortable yet. The apology had been a start, but it hadn't erased the lifetime that came before it. About halfway there, he gave up on small talk and turned on the radio, some classical station that filled the silence with orchestral music. I watched the landscape change outside the window, the dense forests giving way to glimpses of the Columbia River, wide and gray under the cloudy sky. "Vanessa's pregnant," Daniel said suddenly, about 20 miles from Astoria. The announcement hung in the air between us. I turned to look at him, surprised. "Congratulations." "Thanks." He kept his eyes on the road. "We just found out last week. She's only about 2 months along, so we're not telling people yet, but I thought you should know." "Why?" The question came out sharper than I intended. He glanced at me, then back to the road. "Because you're my sister. Because this kid is going to be your niece or nephew. Because despite everything that's happened, we're still family." Family. The word had always felt complicated coming from him, weighted with conditions and hierarchies. But there was something in his voice now, something uncertain, almost vulnerable. Does this change anything? I asked. About the project? No, he said firmly. If anything, it makes it more important. I want my kid to grow up in a family that's not as broken as ours was. I want them to have an aunt who's present, who matters. I want them to see their parents working together instead of pretending the other doesn't exist. The admission surprised me. I'd expected many things from Daniel: defensiveness, arrogance, resentment, but not this raw honesty. I want that too, I said quietly. But Daniel, you have to understand, an apology on paper doesn't fix 32 years. Working together on this project doesn't automatically make us close. We have a lot of history to work through. I know, he said. I'm not expecting everything to be perfect. I'm just hoping it can be better than it was. We drove the rest of the way in silence, but it felt different now, less hostile, more contemplative. When we pulled up to the warehouse, I saw it through Daniel's eyes for the first time. The broken windows, the overgrown lot, the general air of abandonment. He let out a low whistle as he parked. This is what Dad bought. It's a disaster. It's got good bones, I said, echoing what Kyle had told me. The structure is sound, the location is prime, and it's got enough space to do everything the plans call for. It just needs vision. And about $1 million in renovations, Daniel muttered, but he got out of the car. I unlocked the door and let him inside, watching his face as the lights flickered on. His expression moved through several stages: skepticism, surprise, and then something that might have been understanding. He walked slowly through the space, taking in the vintage tools, the workbenches, the blueprints still spread on the central table. Dad really planned this out, he said, studying the drawings. They both did. Mom too. She wrote me a letter explaining why they wanted this built, what they hoped it would accomplish. Daniel looked up sharply. A letter? I pulled it from my backpack. The paper softened from being read and reread. I handed it to him, watching as his eyes moved across our mother's handwriting. His expression shifted as he read, pain and regret playing across his features. When he finished, he carefully refolded the letter and handed it back to me. They blamed themselves, he said quietly, for how things turned out between us. They should, I replied. They created the dynamic that made you think you were worth more than me. I never thought that, Daniel said, but the protest was weak. Didn't you? Every time Dad asked for your opinion and ignored mine? Every time you were included in business decisions and I wasn't? Every time I accomplished something and you barely acknowledged it because you were too busy with your own success? Your actions said you thought you were worth more, Daniel. Even if you never said the words. He flinched like I'd slapped him, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned back to the blueprints, tracing the lines with his finger. So how do we do this? How do we turn this wreck into what they wanted in 9 months? I moved to stand beside him, pulling out my own notes. First, we need to get the building up to code. New windows, updated electrical, proper heating and cooling systems. Kyle thinks that'll take about 6 weeks if we can get the permits processed quickly. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Kyle Bennett? Your contractor friend? He's offered to help manage the project. He won't charge for his time, just wants to see it done right. That's generous of him, Daniel said, and I caught something in his tone that might have been suspicion or maybe just surprise that someone would help me without expecting payment. He believes in what this place could be, I explained. And he's got connections with subcontractors who can work fast and within budget. We'll need plumbers, electricians, HVAC specialists, carpenters for all the workshop space. Then there's the tool organization system, the checkout software, the classroom furniture, the cafe equipment. Daniel pulled out his phone and started making notes. We should create a project timeline, break it into phases. Foundation work first, then systems, then interior build-out, then finishing touches. We'll need contingency buffers for each phase in case something goes wrong. I watched him slip into lawyer mode, organized and methodical, and I could see why my father had thought he'd be good at running the business. He had the ability to break complex problems into manageable pieces, to see the forest and the trees simultaneously. We also need to think about hiring, I added. Once this place is operational, we'll need staff. Someone to manage the tool library, people to teach the workshops, cafe workers. We should start recruiting now so we have time to train them. Good point, Daniel agreed, still typing on his phone. We should also reach out to the city planning department, make sure we understand all the approval requirements. The last thing we need is to finish construction and then get held up because we're missing some permit. We spent the next 3 hours walking through every inch of the warehouse, taking measurements, making lists, identifying problems that would need addressing. The rain started up again outside, drumming on the metal roof, but inside the cavernous space it felt almost peaceful. We worked well together, I realized with some surprise. When we focused on the task rather than our history, we complemented each other's skills. Daniel saw the logistical challenges and regulatory requirements. I saw the human element, how the space would flow, what people would need to feel comfortable and welcome. By early afternoon, we'd filled 2 entire notebooks with plans and questions and potential solutions. We stood in what would eventually become the cafe space, looking out through the grimy windows at the river beyond. This could actually work, Daniel said, and he sounded almost surprised. It will work, I corrected. It has to. He turned to face me, his expression serious. Emma, I know the apology I gave at Walsh's office was formal, legal, whatever. But I meant it. I've been thinking a lot since Mom and Dad died, about how things were, how I benefited from their favoritism without questioning it. That wasn't fair to you. No, it wasn't, I agreed. But you're here now. You're trying. That's more than I expected a month ago. Vanessa told me I was an idiot, Daniel said with a slight smile. When I was considering fighting the trust terms, refusing to work with you. She said I was letting my pride cost me millions of dollars and a relationship with my only sister. She wasn't wrong. I'm starting to like Vanessa more than I expected, I admitted. Don't tell her that, Daniel said. Her ego's big enough already. We both laughed, and it felt strange, laughing together without edge or tension. When was the last time we'd laughed together? I honestly couldn't remember. We should head back, Daniel said, checking his watch. But I think we made good progress today. I'll start researching contractors and permit requirements this week. You work on the community outreach side, figure out what kind of programming people actually want. The drive back to Portland felt different than the drive out. We talked about the project, yes, but also about other things. Daniel told me about the case he was working on, a complicated corporate merger that was giving him headaches. I told him about a German shepherd I'd treated at the clinic who'd swallowed an entire sock and somehow survived. Small talk, meaningless in many ways, but it was the kind of conversation siblings were supposed to have. Normal. Easy. By the time he dropped me off at my apartment, the November darkness had already settled over the city. Same time next week? Daniel asked. We should get Kyle involved, start getting estimates from contractors. Sounds good. I agreed, gathering my backpack. And Daniel? Thank you. For today. For actually showing up and working with me instead of against me. He nodded, something complicated passing across his face. That's what family does, right? Shows up? That's what family should do, I corrected gently. We're still learning. He drove away, and I stood on the sidewalk watching his taillights disappear into the rainy night. Kyle had been right. Daniel wasn't the villain I'd built him up to be in my mind, and I wasn't the helpless victim. We were just 2 people damaged by the same dysfunctional family dynamics, trying to figure out how to be better than what we'd been taught. The next few weeks blurred together in a frenzy of planning and preparation. Kyle joined us for our second trip to Astoria, bringing along his camera and measuring tools, documenting everything we'd need to know about the building's current state. He crawled through spaces, Daniel, and I wouldn't have thought to check, pointing out structural issues that needed addressing, systems that were outdated but salvageable, potential problems that could balloon into disasters if not caught early. The good news is the foundation is solid, Kyle reported as we huddled around the blueprints. The bad news is the electrical system is a fire hazard waiting to happen. We need to gut it completely and start fresh. How much is that going to cost? Daniel asked, his lawyer instincts immediately jumping to budget concerns. Kyle pulled out his estimate. Between materials and labor, probably $80,000. That's if we go with commercial-grade stuff that'll last 20 years, which we should. Cutting corners on electrical is asking for trouble. Daniel winced but nodded. Okay. That comes out of the development fund. What else? We went through Kyle's entire assessment, pricing out each major system. The HVAC was another $60,000. The windows would run $40,000. Plumbing updates, $30,000. Before we'd even touched the interior build-out, we were looking at over $200,000 just to bring the building up to code and operational standards. The contingency fund is $300,000, I said, consulting the trust documents. If we use $200 just on the basics, that doesn't leave us much room for error. Then we don't make errors, Kyle said simply. We plan carefully, we hire good people, and we manage every dollar like it matters because it does. Daniel was making calculations on his phone, his expression growing more concerned. Even if everything goes perfectly, we're going to be cutting it close. If we hit any major unexpected costs, if there are delays that push us over the 9-month deadline, we could be in trouble. So we build in buffers, I said. We start immediately, work as efficiently as possible, and we communicate constantly so nothing falls through the cracks. This is doable, Daniel. It's tight, but it's doable. He looked at me, and I saw something shift in his expression. Respect, maybe, or at least recognition that I wasn't approaching this naively. All right. Let's do this. Kyle, can you put together a master timeline with all the phases? Emma, you reach out to the city and start the permit process. I'll handle contractor vetting and insurance requirements. We divided the responsibilities naturally, playing to each person's strengths. Over the following weeks, we fell into a rhythm. Tuesday evenings, we'd meet at Daniel and Vanessa's house, spreading papers across their dining room table, working through decisions over takeout dinners. Saturdays, we'd drive to Astoria together, meeting with inspectors and contractors, watching as the warehouse slowly transformed from abandoned building to construction site. The first major milestone came in mid-December when we got city approval for our renovation plans. The planning department had been surprisingly supportive, especially when we explained the community focus of the project. Astoria was a working-class town, and the idea of a free tool library and skill-building workshops resonated with the officials we spoke to. This is exactly the kind of thing we need more of, the planning director told us during our final approval meeting. Too many communities are losing the knowledge of how to fix and build things. Projects like this preserve those skills while making them accessible to everyone. You have our full support. Daniel and I had driven up together for that meeting, and on the way back, buzzing with the victory of approval, he brought up something that had clearly been on his mind. I've been thinking about the hardware store, the southeast location. I tensed immediately, wondering if he was going to ask for it back, claim he'd made a mistake in agreeing to transfer it. What about it? Frank Delgado called me last week. He wanted to let me know that you're doing a good job, that the staff likes the changes you're implementing. He said the community programs you brought back are already bringing in new customers. I relaxed slightly. Frank's been amazing. He knows that store inside and out, knows the customers, the community. I'm learning a lot from him. He also said you're working too hard, Daniel continued. Between the clinic and the store and this project, you're spreading yourself thin. He's worried about you burning out. The concern in his voice surprised me. I'm managing, I said, which wasn't entirely true. I was exhausted most days, running on coffee and determination, but I wasn't about to admit weakness to Daniel. You don't have to manage alone, he said carefully. I know the store is yours now, completely yours, and I'm not trying to take that back. But I still have relationships with the vendors. I know the business operations inside and out. If you ever need help or advice, you can ask. No strings attached. It was an olive branch, extended carefully, and I knew what it cost him to offer. Daniel had never been good at admitting he might be useful without being in control. Thank you, I said. I might take you up on that. There's some inventory management stuff that Frank and I are still trying to figure out. Anytime, Daniel said, and I thought he meant it. Christmas came and went in a strange blur. Daniel and Vanessa invited me to their house for dinner, The first time we'd gathered for a holiday as adults without our parents there. Vanessa was starting to show now, a small bump visible under her designer maternity clothes. She'd softened toward me too, I'd noticed, treating me less like competition, and more like someone who might actually be part of their lives going forward. "How's the morning sickness?" I asked her as we worked together in the kitchen, preparing sides while Daniel attempted to cook a turkey that was probably too ambitious for his skill level. "Brutal," Vanessa admitted. "I spent the entire first trimester feeling like I was on a boat in a storm. It's finally starting to ease up, thank God. My mom used to say ginger helped." I offered, then paused, realizing I was sharing a memory of our mother with my brother's wife. Vanessa smiled gently. "Daniel told me that too. Your mom gave him a whole list of things to look out for. What helped her when she was pregnant with you too? He's been surprisingly attentive, actually. I think becoming a father is making him reconsider a lot of things." "Like what?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Like what kind of man he wants to be," Vanessa said. "He's been reading parenting books, going to therapy, really examining the patterns from your family. He doesn't want to repeat the same mistakes your parents made. He wants to be better." The revelation that Daniel was in therapy surprised me more than anything else had in the past 2 months. My brother, who'd always seemed so certain of himself, so comfortable in his role as the golden child, was questioning everything. Maybe that was what it took to change. A complete disruption of the status you'd taken for granted. Dinner was chaotic and slightly overcooked but genuinely enjoyable. We laughed more than we'd laughed in years, told stories about Christmases past, carefully navigating around the painful memories while celebrating the good ones. When I left that evening, my car loaded with leftovers and a strange lightness in my chest, I realized something had shifted. We weren't a perfect family. We might never be a close family. But we were becoming something real, something honest, and that was more than I'd had before. The new year brought renewed intensity to the Astoria project. Construction began in earnest in early January, and suddenly the warehouse was full of workers, noise, and steady transformation. The old windows were torn out and replaced with energy-efficient glass that let in floods of natural light. The electrical system was completely rewired, new panels installed, everything brought up to current code. The HVAC system went in next, massive units that would keep the space comfortable year-round. Kyle was on site almost daily, managing the various contractors, solving problems as they arose, keeping us on schedule and under budget. I drove up whenever I could break away from the clinic and the store, usually on Saturdays with Daniel. We'd put on hard hats and walk through the space, watching it transform from our parents' dream on paper into physical reality. "The classroom space is going to be perfect," I said one February afternoon, standing in what would eventually be the woodworking instruction area. The floors were still rough concrete, the walls unpainted drywall, but I could see it. Long work benches, proper ventilation for sawdust, storage for student projects. "Kyle's bringing in a master carpenter next week to consult on the workshop design," Daniel said, checking his ever-present phone for the schedule. "Someone who's taught classes before, who can tell us what works and what doesn't from an instructor's perspective." "That's smart," I agreed. "We should do that for all the specialty areas. Bring in experts who can help us design spaces that actually function well for teaching." We'd fallen into an easy working partnership by then, 2 months into the project. We still disagreed sometimes, Daniel wanting to cut costs in areas where I thought investment was important, me wanting to add features that Daniel thought were unnecessary luxuries. But we'd learned to compromise, to hear each other out, to recognize that we were both working toward the same goal. The biggest fight we had was in March, over the cafe space. I wanted to hire a local coffee roaster and create a real gathering spot, somewhere people would want to linger and talk. Daniel thought a basic coffee maker and some vending machines would suffice and save us significant operating costs. "The cafe isn't just about coffee," I argued, standing in the space that was finally starting to look finished. The floors were polished concrete now. The walls painted a warm cream color. "It's about creating community, giving people a reason to come here even when they're not checking out tools or taking a class." "But the ongoing costs," Daniel countered. "Hiring cafe staff, buying supplies, maintaining equipment. That's money that comes out of operational budget indefinitely. We need this place to be sustainable long-term, not just impressive at opening. It will be sustainable, I insisted. Good coffee and light food will generate revenue, not just cost money. People will pay $3 for a decent latte while they're here anyway. Why not capture that income and make the space more welcoming at the same time? We went back and forth for an hour, neither of us willing to budge. Finally, Kyle interrupted us. Why don't you do a hybrid model? Simple cafe setup. Hire one experienced barista who can train volunteers from the community. Keep the menu limited but good quality. Low overhead, but still creates the atmosphere Emma wants. Daniel and I looked at each other, both recognizing the wisdom of the compromise. That could work, Daniel admitted reluctantly. We'd need to research the numbers, figure out if the revenue would cover the costs. I'll put together a proposal, I offered. Give me a week to research equipment costs, potential suppliers, typical cafe margins. Then we can make an informed decision. Daniel nodded. And just like that, the fight diffused. We were learning, slowly, how to work through conflict instead of letting it destroy us. By April, with 2 months left on our timeline, the warehouse was recognizable as what it would become. The tool library section had floor-to-ceiling storage systems installed, organized by category. Hand tools in one section, power tools in another, specialized equipment like sanders and tile cutters in a secured area. The checkout desk was built, a beautiful piece of reclaimed wood that Kyle had salvaged from another project. The classroom spaces were taking shape too. The woodworking area had proper ventilation installed and fire-resistant walls. The metalworking section had welding booths with ventilation hoods. The general repair classroom had workbenches at different heights to accommodate various needs and abilities. The small engine repair area had proper drainage for oil changes and chemical storage for cleaning supplies. Walking through it all, I felt something swell in my chest that might have been pride. This was real. This was happening. My parents' dream was becoming concrete and steel and possibility. We need to start thinking about grand opening, Daniel said during one of our Saturday site visits in late April. We're on track to finish construction by the end of May. That gives us June to hire staff, stock the tool library, finalize the class schedule, and do a soft opening before the big public launch. I've been working on the community outreach, I told him. I've connected with the local schools, community colleges, trade programs. There's a lot of interest in partnership opportunities, students who could volunteer here for credit, instructors who want to teach workshops. Good, Daniel said. I've been talking to local businesses about sponsorship opportunities. Several of them are interested in donating tools or funding specific programs. The hardware supply company wants to sponsor the basic home repair workshops. The local electricians union wants to fund a women in trades program. We were both bringing our strengths to bear now, Daniel's business connections and my community relationships combining to create something stronger than either of us could have built alone. In early May, Vanessa went into early labor at 34 weeks. Daniel called me from the hospital, his voice tight with fear. They're doing an emergency C-section. The baby's in distress. Can you come? I was at the hardware store when I got the call, in the middle of inventory with Frank. Go, Frank said before I could even ask. Family comes first. We'll handle this. I drove to the hospital faster than I should have, my heart hammering. Vanessa and Daniel's baby, my niece or nephew, arriving too early in danger. It felt impossibly unfair that after everything, after we'd finally started to rebuild our relationship, this could be taken away. The waiting room was sterile and too bright, filled with anxious families waiting for news. I found Daniel pacing in front of the surgical wing doors, still in his work clothes, his hair disheveled from running his hands through it repeatedly. Any news? I asked and he shook his head. They took her in 20 minutes ago. The doctor said the baby's heartbeat was irregular, they couldn't wait. Emma, what if something goes wrong? What if I lose them? I'd never seen my brother like this, vulnerable and terrified. All his usual confidence stripped away. I took his hand, squeezed it tight. They're in good hands. The doctors know what they're doing. Vanessa is strong, and your baby is a fighter. You have to believe that. We sat together in those uncomfortable waiting room chairs, and Daniel talked. He told me about finding out Vanessa was pregnant, about the first ultrasound where they'd heard the heartbeat, about choosing names, about all the fears he'd been carrying about being a good father. "I don't want to be like Dad," he said quietly. "I don't want my kid to grow up feeling like they have to be perfect to earn my love, or like one child matters more than another if we have more kids." "You won't be," I told him. "You're already different because you're questioning it, because you're examining those patterns instead of repeating them blindly. Your kid is lucky to have you, Daniel." He looked at me, his eyes red-rimmed. "I'm sorry I wasn't a better brother to you, Emma. Growing up, when you needed someone to stand up for you, I should have been that person. Instead, I just accepted the favoritism because it benefited me. I'm sorry." "I know," I said, and I meant it. I'd heard his formal apology months ago, but this felt different, raw and real and born from a place of genuine fear and reflection. "We're doing better now. That's what matters." A doctor emerged from the surgical wing an hour later, still in scrubs, a surgical mask pulled down around her neck. "Mr. Torres?" Daniel jumped up, nearly knocking over his chair. "That's me. Are they okay? Is my wife okay? The baby?" The doctor smiled, and I saw Daniel's entire body sag with relief before she even spoke. "Your wife is fine. Recovering from surgery, but she did great. And you have a daughter. She's small, only 4 pounds, so she'll need to spend some time in the NICU. But she's breathing on her own, her vitals are good. She's a fighter." Daniel actually sobbed, one hand covering his mouth, the other clutching my arm for support. I held him while he fell apart with relief. This brother who'd spent our whole childhood being told emotions were weakness, finally letting himself feel everything. We were allowed in to see Vanessa after another hour, once she'd been moved to recovery. She looked exhausted and pale but radiantly happy, her hand resting on her deflated belly. "They said she's okay," Vanessa said when she saw Daniel, fresh tears streaming down her face. "Our girl is okay." "Have you seen her?" Daniel asked, moving to her side, taking her hand. "Just for a minute before they took her to NICU. She's so tiny, Daniel. But she has your nose, I swear she does." They let us visit the NICU 15 minutes at a time. The baby, who they'd named Sophie after Vanessa's grandmother, lay in an incubator, impossibly small, wires and tubes monitoring her every breath. But her eyes were open, dark and alert, and when Daniel carefully slid his hand through the incubator opening to touch her tiny fingers, she wrapped her hand around one of his. "Hey there, Sophie," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm your dad. And this is your Aunt Emma. We're going to take such good care of you." I stood there watching my brother fall completely in love with his daughter, and I felt something shift inside me permanently. This baby, this tiny person who'd arrived early and scared us all, represented hope. She was a new beginning, a chance to do things differently, to build a family based on love and equality rather than favoritism and competition. Sophie spent 3 weeks in the NICU, growing stronger each day. Daniel and Vanessa were there constantly, taking turns staying overnight, learning to feed and change and care for their premature daughter. I visited when I could, bringing food and coffee, sitting with them during the long, anxious days of waiting for Sophie to gain enough weight to come home. The Astoria project continued through all of it, Kyle holding down the fort while Daniel's attention was split between his daughter and the construction timeline. We were cutting it close now, racing against the late May deadline with a dozen finishing touches still needed. "We're going to make it," Kyle assured me during one of our nightly phone calls. "The tool organization system is almost complete, the classrooms are furnished, the cafe equipment is being installed tomorrow. We're basically down to painting the bathrooms and hanging the artwork." "What about staffing?" I asked, exhausted from another 12-hour day split between the clinic and the hardware store. "I've hired the tool library manager and 3 part-time circulation clerks," Kyle reported. "The barista starts training next week. And we have volunteers lined up to help with the grand opening. Emma, we're actually going to pull this off." I wanted to believe him, but I was too tired to feel triumphant yet. There was still so much to do, so many details that could go wrong. Sophie came home from the hospital on a Wednesday in mid-May, weighing 5 pounds and healthy enough to leave the NICU. Daniel called me from the car as they drove her home. and I could hear the wonder in his voice. "We're bringing our daughter home, Emma. She's actually coming home." "I'm so happy for you," I said, and meant it completely. "Take the time you need with her. The project is under control." "No," Daniel said firmly. "We're partners on this. I'll be there Saturday for the final walkthrough. Vanessa's mom is coming to help, and Sophie will be fine for a few hours. We're going to finish this together." Saturday arrived overcast but warm, late May in Oregon, the rain finally giving way to something that felt like spring. Daniel and I met at the warehouse, along with Kyle and Walsh, who'd driven up to inspect the finished project and certify completion for the trust requirements. The transformation was stunning. Where there had been broken windows and decay, there was now light and life. The tool library gleamed with organized efficiency, thousands of tools arranged and labeled, the checkout system ready to process its first borrowers. The classrooms were inviting and functional, each one equipped for its specific purpose. The cafe was small but charming, with its reclaimed wood counter and chalkboard menu, ready to serve coffee and simple food to visitors. Walsh walked through slowly, making notes, comparing the reality to the plans my parents had left. When he'd seen everything, he turned to Daniel and me with a satisfied smile. "I think your parents would be incredibly proud. You've not only met their specifications, you've exceeded them. This is exactly what they envisioned, maybe even better." Daniel and I looked at each other, and I saw my own emotions reflected in his face. Relief, pride, grief for the parents who'd never see this completed, gratitude that we'd made it here at all. "We did it," I said quietly. 9 months, $2.5 million, and somehow we actually did it. "We make a good team," Daniel replied, and he wasn't being condescending or grudging. He meant it. Kyle produced a bottle of champagne from somewhere, and we toasted in the cafe space that would soon be filled with community members. "To Arthur and Linda Torres," Walsh said, raising his plastic cup, "who loved their children enough to force them to see each other clearly. To second chances," I added. "And to little Sophie," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "May she grow up in a family that knows how to do better." We drank cheap champagne in a community center built from dreams and determination, and it felt like everything I'd fought for was finally real. The grand opening was scheduled for the first Saturday in June. We'd marketed it throughout Astoria and the surrounding communities, posted on social media, reached out to local media. The response had been overwhelming, hundreds of people RSVPing, expressing interest in membership, asking about volunteer opportunities. The morning of the opening, I woke up at 5, too anxious and excited to sleep. I drove up to Astoria alone, wanting time to walk through the space one more time before the crowds arrived. The sun was just rising over the river, painting everything gold and pink. Inside the warehouse, everything was ready. Fresh coffee brewing in the cafe, tools arranged perfectly on their shelves, classroom spaces set up for demonstration workshops throughout the day. Daniel arrived an hour later with Vanessa and Sophie, who slept peacefully in her carrier, oblivious to the significance of the day. Kyle came with a small army of volunteers, ready to help manage the crowds and answer questions. At 9 in the morning, we unlocked the doors and people started flowing in. Families, retirees, young professionals, students, people from all walks of life, coming to see what we'd built. They moved through the space with wonder, examining the tools, asking questions about membership, signing up for workshops. The woodworking classroom filled for a demonstration on building basic shelves. The cafe did brisk business, the barista barely keeping up with orders. The tool library had a line of people signing up for membership cards, eager to check out equipment for their own home projects. I stood near the entrance with Daniel, watching it all unfold, and I felt tears burning behind my eyes. This was what my parents had wanted. Not just a building or a service, but a gathering place. A space where people could learn and create and connect. Where the barriers of cost and knowledge were removed, where everyone was welcome. They would have loved this, Daniel said quietly, watching a grandfather show his grandson how to properly hold a hammer at one of the demonstration tables. They would have loved seeing us work together to make it happen, I corrected. That's what they wanted most of all, I think. For us to finally see each other. He nodded, then surprised me by pulling me into a hug. Not a formal greeting hug or an obligatory family gathering hug, but a real embrace, the kind siblings give when they genuinely care about each other. "Thank you," he whispered. "For not giving up on me. For pushing back and demanding better. I needed it, even if I couldn't see that at the time." I hugged him back, this brother who'd been a stranger for so many years, who was finally becoming someone I actually liked. "We're going to be okay," I told him. "Our family is going to be okay." The celebration continued through the afternoon. Walsh made a brief speech about my parents' vision and generosity. The mayor of Astoria spoke about community and the importance of spaces like this. Daniel and I were asked to say a few words, and I watched my brother transform into the confident public speaker he'd always been, thanking everyone who'd made the center possible. When it was my turn, I kept it simple. I talked about my mother's letter, about her belief that inheritance wasn't in what you owned but in what you built for others. I talked about learning to see my own worth, about the importance of fighting for your place at the table. And I talked about hope, about how even broken families could find their way back to something whole if everyone was willing to try. The applause was warm and genuine, and as I stepped away from the microphone, I caught Kyle's eye across the room. He was grinning, giving me a thumbs up, proud of me in the way only true friends can be. The grand opening wound down as evening approached, the crowds thinning, volunteers beginning cleanup. Daniel and Vanessa left to get Sophie home for her evening routine. Kyle stayed to help me lock up, walking through the empty space one last time. "You did it," he said as we stood in the cafe, chairs upside down on tables, the smell of coffee still lingering in the air. "You took your parents' dream and made it real. You took a broken relationship with your brother and turned it into a partnership. You took every obstacle they threw at you and turned it into opportunity. Emma, I am so proud of you." I leaned against him, exhausted and satisfied and more at peace than I'd felt in years. "I couldn't have done it without you. Without your help managing the construction. Your support through all of this. Your belief that I could actually pull this off." "You were always capable of pulling this off," Kyle said. "You just needed the chance to prove it. To yourself more than anyone else." We locked up the community center as the sun set over the Columbia River, painting the water in shades of orange and purple. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel, a photo of Sophie sleeping peacefully in her crib, with a message underneath. "She's going to grow up knowing her Aunt Emma is someone who builds things that matter. Thank you for showing me what that looks like." I saved the photo, tucked the phone back in my pocket, and got into my car for the drive back to Portland. The hardware store would be waiting Monday morning, full of its own challenges and opportunities. The clinic would need me for my regular shifts. Life would continue in its complicated, demanding way. But I had something now I hadn't had 6 months ago. I had proof that I mattered, that my voice and vision and presence made a difference. I had a brother who was becoming a friend. I had a business I'd earned and a legacy I'd built. And I had the knowledge that when life tried to make me invisible, I'd fought back and made myself impossible to ignore. The warehouse in Astoria would open its doors every day now, helping people fix and build and create. The Torres family legacy wasn't just in the hardware stores or the money or the property. It was in the space where a community could gather, where skills could be passed down, where everyone was welcome regardless of what they owned or what they could afford. My parents had made mistakes, shown favoritism, waited too long to correct their wrongs. But in the end, they'd given me something more valuable than money. They'd given me the framework to prove myself, the challenge that forced me to recognize my own strength, the project that showed me I'd been worth it all along. I just needed to believe it myself. As I drove through the night toward home, toward whatever came next, I felt something settle in my chest that had been restless my entire life. I felt seen. I felt valued. I felt like I finally belonged. 6 months after the grand opening, I stood in the community center on a crisp December morning, watching the space hum with life. The tool library had over 300 active members now, people checking out everything from basic screwdrivers to specialized equipment for home renovations. The workshops were booked solid through February, classes on everything from furniture restoration to basic plumbing filling up within hours of being posted. The cafe had become exactly what I'd hoped, a gathering spot where regulars knew each other by name, where conversations about projects turned into friendships, where the smell of good coffee mixed with sawdust and possibility. I was meeting with the board we'd established to oversee the center's operations, 5 community members who volunteered their time to help guide the programming and ensure we stayed true to my parents' vision. Daniel sat on the board too, though he'd insisted on being a regular member rather than holding any leadership position. He wanted to contribute, he'd said, but this was my project to lead. The meeting focused on expansion possibilities. We'd been so successful that surrounding communities were asking about satellite locations, smaller versions of what we'd built here. The board was enthusiastic, already brainstorming funding sources and potential partnerships. I listened to their ideas, making notes, but I was cautious about growing too fast. Better to do one thing excellently than spread ourselves thin trying to be everywhere at once. After the meeting ended, I walked through the woodworking classroom where a weekend workshop was in full swing. 15 people of various ages bent over their projects, a master carpenter moving between them offering guidance and encouragement. I recognized Mrs. Patterson from the local library, carefully sanding a bookshelf she was building for her grandson. Next to her, a teenager I'd seen at previous workshops was constructing an intricate jewelry box, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. This was the dream realized, not just tools and space, but knowledge being passed down, skills being preserved, confidence being built with every completed project. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. A photo of Sophie, now 9 months old, sitting in a pile of wooden blocks, her face scrunched in concentration as she tried to stack them. The message read, "Future engineer? She's got your determination and my stubbornness. We're in trouble." I smiled, typing back, "She's perfect. See you both for dinner Sunday?" His response came immediately. "Wouldn't miss it. Vanessa's making that pasta you love." Sunday dinners had become a tradition over the past few months, rotating between their house and my apartment, which I'd finally upgraded to a small 2-bedroom now that the hardware store profits were steady. We'd cook together, Daniel and I trading stories about our week while Vanessa managed Sophie's chaos with practiced ease. It wasn't the family dinners I'd grown up with, formal and tense and full of unspoken criticism. These were loud and messy and real, built on a foundation of honesty we'd fought hard to establish. The hardware store continued to thrive under my management. Frank had become not just an employee but a mentor, teaching me the intricacies of the business my grandfather had built. We'd expanded the community programs even further, offering monthly workshops on home repair basics that drew standing room-only crowds. The tool lending library we'd re-established had a waiting list. People trusted us because we'd proven we cared about more than just profit margins. We cared about serving the community, about empowering people to fix and build and create. I'd hired 2 new staff members at the store, young people eager to learn the trade, and watching them grow in their roles gave me the same satisfaction I felt watching workshop participants at the community center master new skills. That evening, as I locked up the community center and headed to my car, Kyle called. He'd been on a job site in Seattle for the past week, managing a major commercial renovation, but he called every night to check in. We'd grown even closer through the whole Astoria project, our friendship deepening into something I was still trying to fully understand. "How was the board meeting?" he asked, and I could hear traffic noise in the background. "Productive. They want to expand, open satellite locations in other communities." I told them we need to solidify what we have here first. Make sure we're sustainable long-term before we start dreaming bigger. "Smart," Kyle agreed. "You've always been good at seeing the big picture without losing sight of the foundation. That's why this whole thing worked." We talked for an hour, about the center, about the store, about his project in Seattle. Easy conversation, the kind where silence was comfortable and laughter came naturally. When we finally said goodnight, I sat in my car for a moment, feeling grateful for all the ways my life had changed. I'd lost my parents, yes, and that grief still surfaced at unexpected moments. But I'd gained so much more than I'd lost. I'd found my voice, my strength, my place in a family that was learning to value me. I'd built something that would outlast all of us, a legacy of community and skill and opportunity. Sunday dinner at Daniel and Vanessa's was exactly the kind of chaos I'd come to love. Sophie had discovered she could throw food, and Vanessa spent half the meal intercepting pieces of pasta before they hit the wall. Daniel had attempted to make homemade bread, which had come out slightly lopsided but tasted delicious anyway. We ate and laughed and argued playfully about everything from politics to whether Sophie was too young for a toy hammer, which Daniel insisted she needed and Vanessa absolutely refused to allow. After dinner, Daniel and I cleaned up while Vanessa put Sophie to bed. Standing at the sink washing dishes, shoulder to shoulder with my brother, felt surreal in the best way. A year ago we'd barely spoken. Now we had rhythms and routines, inside jokes and shared responsibilities. "I've been thinking about Mom and Dad a lot lately," Daniel said as he dried a plate. "About whether they'd be proud of what we've built, or disappointed it took their deaths to get us here." I considered the question, my hands in warm soapy water. I think they'd be both. Proud of the community center, proud that we found our way to something real between us. But sad that they couldn't see it, that they didn't do more while they were alive to fix what they'd broken. "Yeah," Daniel agreed quietly. "I wish I could tell Dad that I finally understand what he was trying to teach me about responsibility and legacy. And I wish I could tell Mom that her letter, the one she left for you, it changed everything. It made me see what I'd been blind to." We finished the dishes in comfortable silence, then joined Vanessa in the living room where she'd collapsed on the couch, exhausted from wrangling a 9-month-old. "Your daughter is a terrorist," she announced dramatically. She threw an entire handful of peas directly at my face during dinner. With intent. I saw the calculation in her eyes. Daniel laughed, settling next to her and pulling her feet into his lap. "She's practicing her aim. Future softball player." "Future menace," Vanessa corrected, but she was smiling. I watched them together, easy and affectionate, and I felt that same sense of peace I'd been carrying since the community center opened. This was family. Not perfect, not without its complications, but real and present and trying. That was more than enough. As I drove home that night, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Emma Torres?" a woman's voice asked. "This is Judith Chun from the Community Foundation. I'm calling because we've been following the success of the Astoria Community Center, and we're interested in discussing a partnership opportunity. We have funding available for projects that match your model, and we'd love to explore the possibility of helping you expand to other communities." I pulled over, my heart suddenly racing. This was what the board had been hoping for, external funding and support that could make expansion possible without stretching our resources too thin. We talked for 20 minutes, Judith outlining the foundation's mission and interests, me describing our vision and values. By the time we hung up, we had a meeting scheduled for the following week to discuss specifics. I sat in my parked car, overlooking the city lights of Portland, and I thought about how far I'd come from that devastating day in Walsh's office. The girl who'd been told she inherited nothing had built an empire of her own, not through money or property, but through vision and determination and refusing to accept being invisible. The hardware store was mine. The community center was thriving. My relationship with Daniel had transformed from hostile strangers to genuine siblings. And now, opportunities were opening up that I'd never imagined possible. I called Daniel first, unable to contain the news. He answered sleepily, Sophie probably having just gone down, but he woke up fast when I told him about the foundation's call. "Emma, that's incredible. This could be exactly what we need to expand responsibly, with proper support and funding." "I know," I said, unable to keep the excitement out of my voice. "It's everything we talked about, but better than I hoped." Then I called Kyle, who whooped so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "I knew it. I knew people would recognize what you'd built, and want to be part of it. Emma, you're about to change communities all over the state, maybe even beyond. This is just the beginning." Just the beginning. The words settled over me like a promise. My parents had left me a puzzle to solve, a challenge wrapped in grief and disappointment. But in solving it, in fighting for my place and building something meaningful, I discovered who I was meant to be. Not the overlooked daughter, not the sister who didn't matter, but a builder of community, a champion of accessibility, someone who saw people and their potential and created spaces where both could flourish. The meeting with the Community Foundation led to a partnership that would change everything. They offered funding for 3 satellite community centers over the next 2 years, along with operational support and connections to other organizations doing similar work. Daniel and I would oversee the expansion, ensuring each new location maintained the values and vision of the original. The work ahead would be challenging, demanding, full of obstacles and decisions and the kind of growing pains that come with success. But I was ready for it, equipped not just with skills and experience, but with the knowledge that I belonged at this table, that my voice mattered, that I could build things that changed lives. Standing in the Astoria Community Center on a random Tuesday afternoon, watching a grandmother teach her granddaughter how to properly measure wood for a birdhouse, I understood what my mother had meant in her letter. The inheritance wasn't in what you owned. It was in what you built for others, in the legacy you created that would ripple forward long after you were gone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.